Welcome back to Tech Talks with Grace, the show where we turn operational chaos into clarity, one system at a time. I'm Grace, and today we're tackling a topic that's often overlooked but absolutely essential: workflow mapping. Last episode, we explored the 5 signals that show your business is ready for automation. But before you automate, you need to see what's actually happening in your business. That means mapping your workflows. Not just what you think is happening, but what's really happening. Remember, visibility is everything. When you can see your processes clearly, you can fix what's broken, streamline what's slow, and set the stage for automation that actually works. So let's dive in. So, why does it matter? Why workflow mapping matters? Most businesses and most business owners operate on assumptions, not the truth, not the single points of truth we were discussing in the previous episode. You think you know how things work, but when you actually put pen to paper and map it out, you realize you have steps missing, there's duplicated steps, efforts, everything. There's no clear owner. Nobody owns the data, the process, or the system. Or even worse, and this unfortunately does happen more often than we would like as business owners, no one is following the same process. So you've got intake agents following one process, you've possibly got paralegals following another, you've got your partners following yet a third process, and none of it has been mapped out, and nobody knows what one person is doing versus the other. And so all of your data is potentially in different locations. So again, understanding the workflow and why it matters is because you need to understand how your business works. How does your data work? Mapping your workflow gives you this operational truth that you absolutely need in order to move forward with growth in mind, with anything. You need to map your workflows. And that's everything, every process that you have, every system that you use. And what it's going to do for you is it shows you what's working, what's broken, and what's missing. It's the difference between running your business on hope and running it on clarity. So again, that's the why behind this. Why you're going to listen to the rest of this episode is because it's going to not just tell you why it's important, but I'm going to give you some very actionable things you can do today as soon as you're done here listening to this episode and actually go and map your workflows. So what is it though, right? That's the next question I obviously will get is, what is a workflow map? So a workflow map is a visual or written outline of how a process moves from start to finish. I will repeat that. A workflow map is a visual or written outline of how a process moves from start to finish. As I said before, you can do this on a piece of paper, on a napkin. It doesn't matter as long as you map it out from beginning to end. And what does it include? So a workflow map will have every single step in the process. Every step, even if you think it doesn't matter, every single step in the process will be a part of your workflow map. Who is responsible for each step on that workflow? What tools do you use? Do you use a CRM? Do you use email software? Do you use project management? Do you use all 3 pieces? What do you use for this workflow? Where is the information entered? In other words, do they enter it into a CRM? Is it a survey? Is it a case management software? Is it billing software? Where does the information go once it's entered? Is it transferred over to another system? Is it manually entered into yet a third or fourth system? And where is the potential for this information to get lost? So again, I'm going to repeat that part of it because where your information is entered, transferred, or lost is extremely important for your workflow map. You need to understand where your potential for data failures might lie within your workflow. The other component of your workflow map is where and at what point in this workflow are the decisions made. And again, we talked about who owns the data and who owns the process. So where at this juncture within the workflow are the decisions made? The point of that is to understand where you might need to come in as the owner, or might have to assign someone else to that particular part of the process to make the decisions. But again, it's to understand where the decisions are made so that you can either automate it or you can be involved in the workflow part of the process to approve that step in the workflow before moving on to the next step. So moving on from where decisions are made, the last thing you need to understand in your workflow map is where do things get stuck? And drawing this out visually will help you, your team, and all the stakeholders within the company understand exactly where data moves from, to, and where the bottlenecks appear. How do you do that? Well, once you're drawing this out visually, you will start to see, particularly as a business owner, you will certainly start to see where the problems lie. Where does my data go? Where does my data reside? Am I losing data? Am I losing time in manual entries? The workflow map is your baseline to understand where everything is, where everything goes, and then where it's supposed to end up, or where the data points of failure are in that workflow in order to mitigate risk. So the important thing to note here is it isn't about having fancy software. Remember, I said you can do this on a napkin. You can do this on a whiteboard, a Google document, or even just a standard sheet of paper that you pulled out and wrote down. It's about getting it done. So you need to understand that a workflow is helping you understand exactly what happens with the data in your business, which, as I've mentioned many times, it is the lifeblood of your business. Data has all the information you need to move forward or fix anything that you're having trouble with within your workflows. So the goal here, as I've said before, the goal is about visibility and not perfection. You do not need to be perfect. You just need to write it out and understand where things are. So the next question you're asking yourself is how? I mean, where do I get started? I don't even know where I should begin to understand how to map my workflows and all of my systems that I have. Let's break it down one step at a time here. First thing, pick one process. Not two, not three, not four, not five. One process. Something that you do often. Pick something that is impactful to you, like onboarding a client. Again, lifeblood of your business. Pick one process to map the workflow. The second part, list every single step from the very first trigger to the final outcome. So using the onboarding a client as an example, the moment that they experience you as a brand, whether it's the advertising component, whether it's the lead form that they fill out, or if it's a phone call that they're making and speaking to your intake agent, make sure to map out and list every single step from the very first trigger to the final outcome. Next, you need to mark who does what. Make sure you're assigning ownership to every step in the process, to the data points, to the systems, to the workflow itself. It can be the same person for 2 or 3 different steps. Generally speaking, it's 2 to 3 people for the entire workflow, depending on what part of the workflow it is. However, it can be 1 or 2 people that are in charge of all of the data and the systems. However, please make sure you don't overburden the individual. As we get a little bit further into data integrity, and the need for data ownership, you do have to keep in mind that they will need time to ensure that their data is clean, correct, and the way it's supposed to be to your satisfaction as the business owner. And how do you get to that point? It's in mapping the workflows and assigning data stewardship and ownership of the data and the process with their buy-in, though. Okay, so just when you're mapping out this workflow, make sure that you are remembering and understanding how it works, and when you're assigning ownership, that that person truly can own that part of the data or that part of the process. You need to ensure that you're giving them the correct tools to do their jobs, and that includes giving them the right ownership of the right piece of data. It won't make sense to provide ownership to someone who cannot do anything about it. As an example, an intake agent cannot make legal decisions on a part of the process. They can and should, based on your criteria that was established at the outset on the intake form, possibly use that to decide how that person and the intake portion qualifies or doesn't. But any legal decisions made on anything having to do with anything, that should never be left in the hands of anyone other than those that you have trained or yourself. So again, when you're assigning ownership on the workflow task, just ensure that it is the person that is truly responsible, is able to be responsible, and has the tools to manage that data. The next step is highlight your decision points. So this is where that whole idea comes in of you as the owner or someone you trained to think like you do, to make decisions at different points within the system or within the workflow. That's part of the ownership, is where are you needing to step in? Where are your other trained partners supposed to step in to make the decisions in this workflow so that it doesn't break the workflow, it doesn't impede the workflow, it doesn't create a bottleneck in the workflow, and it allows your employees to move forward with their tasks as long as they understand that the decision has to be made by someone that you've selected. So highlight the decision points within the workflow. Make sure that if there's criteria or automated conditional logic, that that's done that way with any outliers. But if there's any particular decision point that has to be made legally or otherwise, you're highlighting that as a decision point that needs to be made. This is where judgment is required, right? Not necessarily conditional logic, just the actual judgment of a person. Now, the next step in mapping this workflow is to note where the data moves from one step to the next in that workflow. Note the tool handoffs. So basically, where does your data move between systems? So if you have an advertisement, it moves from an email form or an online jot form, and then that information goes into an email. Is that email then input into your CRM, or does that information go automatically into your CRM? Where does that information come from and go to? So again, note within the workflow, where does the data move between the systems at any point in that workflow, from beginning to end? And finally, circle the bottlenecks, your friction points. Where do your things slow down? Where is it broken? Where does it get skipped? Again, just remember, it's not about getting it perfect, it's about getting it visible. So let's move on to a little story here. You know, I like to give you stories to hopefully relate to, and that is Summit. The case of Summit marketing. This is a real world example that I'd like to share with you. What they are is, well, the company is a boutique agency that was specializing in digital campaigns for small businesses. What was their problem? Well, so Summit Marketing came and told me that, obviously they pride themselves on personalized service, that wonderful hand holding of every client and ensuring that they have the ultimate success in their onboarding and just taking care of their clients. Well, unfortunately, client onboarding was always a headache for them because of that personalized attempt or personalized service that they were trying to achieve. There was no automation in place to achieve that. So new clients would sign up, but then they'd get a welcome email that sometimes went out twice in the same day, or they would never receive an email. The project folders that were generated, they were in multiple places by different people, depending on who was working that day and onboarding the client. Billing details, even worse, were collected by the account manager, then the finance lead, and a bunch of different people seemed to be touching the billing details. Not a bunch, but everyone that was compliant and allowed to do so. But there were multiple people versus one single source of truth. So it would result in conflicting information. And then the kickoff call was scheduled, but sometimes the client didn't even receive the calendar invite. As you can imagine, the impact was pretty severe for them. They all of a sudden had to were seeing multiple responses from clients saying, "Hey, I'm confused. Sometimes I don't see the email. I didn't receive the onboarding call," and they would miss key steps. Then the team would spend hours each week chasing down this missing information. And so the projects would start late and sometimes with the wrong information. All right, so now you're asking yourself, well, that's all well and good, Grace, but what do we do to fix that? This seems like a normal problem that unfortunately a lot of people have in their businesses. So this is how we fixed it. Summit Marketing decided to map their onboarding workflow. And here's what was discovered during the 5-step process that I provided to you before. They took it and did a step-by-step breakdown. They listed every single action from the contract signing to the kickoff call. Then they went ahead and gave ownership. They had ownership assignments to every step in the process. They were able to clarify who was responsible for each step: the account manager, the finance lead or finance department, or the project lead for each step in this workflow. Again, back to mapping your workflow. Then they moved on to identifying the tool handoffs. They noted, okay, my information moved between the CRM for the client to the email platform and then onto my project management tool. So here are the 3 different systems we use, and this is where the information goes in each of those different steps in the workflow I'm currently mapping for Summit Marketing. Once they did that, they were able to identify the friction points. They circled all the steps where things were slowing down. As I mentioned before, particularly where manual data entry happened twice. So it didn't come in from the email into the CRM automatically, or it didn't come in immediately from the advertisement or the phone call into their CRM automatically, or when they were entering the information into the CRM, it then didn't automatically go into the email platform or the project management tool. So they were able to identify where their bottlenecks were by circling the steps that things were slowing down. And again, particularly with the things where manual data is entered twice. And finally, they were able to see within this workflow map where the decisions had to be made. So they were highlighting where judgment was needed, like customizing the onboarding checklist for each client based on the industry, as an example. So they went through, did their 5-step process, highlighted everything, mapped it all out. What did this result in? What did this do for them by actually undertaking this exercise? So it really helped them kind of approach and deal with this by resulting in 4 main points. They created a single onboarding checklist, shared it in their project management tool. The email for welcome was then automated and triggered only after the billing details were confirmed. Then their project folders were all created from a template and always in the same location. Now everybody knows where the data is, everyone knows where the project folders are, and everyone knows what the naming conventions are. And the kickoff call invite was sent automatically with the calendar link included. Doesn't that sound nice? Everything is humming along, everything looks good, and now their workflow was mapped and implemented. So we talked about the result, but what was the outcome? How did it impact their business? Well, it significantly impacted their business. It onboarded, well, their outcome. The onboarding time dropped from 5 days to 2 days. The clients received a consistent professional experience, and the team spent less time chasing details and more time delivering value. Doesn't that sound great? So what's the lesson here? Summit Marketing didn't need more tools. They needed visibility. Their workflow mapping was the turning point. So, can you expect the same thing? What do you think you'll discover? When you map your workflows, you'll start to see where your data is re entered manually, where your steps might be skipped or unclear, where your tools don't talk to each other, where you're relying on memory instead of systems, where automation could remove friction. This is the foundation for every improvement you'll make going forward. So, I promised you that I would be able to give you some actionable takeaways at the end of this episode. So, here it is. Let's make this real for you. Here's your mini workshop. Step 1, choose one workflow and write down each step from start to finish. Yes, that's right. One workflow. Not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5. One workflow. Write it down. 2, mark any step where the information is re-entered or transferred manually. Something simple, right? Your intake agent takes an email, has to re-enter it manually into the CRM. Mark any step where the information is re-entered or transferred manually. Now, step 3, identify one decision point that could be standardized. Something that you don't have to get involved with. Something that you don't have to actually take a look at every single time because it is a standard decision point that can be automated. Again, this is part of the workflow steps and system. So when you're writing this out, this is your simple workflow map, your very first one. It doesn't need to be pretty. It just needs to be real. The clarity you gain will pay off immediately. Well, so that sort of brings us to the end here. It's been nice speaking with you all. And let's wrap this up here and let you know what you got from this episode. Workflow mapping gives you clarity that you can act on right away. It is the difference between guessing and knowing. When you see your processes clearly, you can fix what's broken, automate what's ready, and scale with confidence. In this next episode, that we're going to connect your workflow insights to your data integrity score so that you can measure where you are and where to focus next. Until then, keep it clear, keep it structured, and I'll see you in episode 4.